Good day and welcome to this feedback video. I will be taking you through Task C of the December 2023 Assessment of Professional Competence Exam. Our presentation will be structured as follows. Number 1. We will unpack what the pre-released information was, focusing on what the candidates should have picked up as triggers, started thinking about, or researching during the 5-day preparation period. Number 2. We will then consider what information was presented on the day, and whether that information supported or was in addition to what was provided in the pre-released information. Lastly, we will then focus on what the task was, i.e., what the required was, that the candidates had to respond to be graded as competent on the task. Right, let us get into it. As a starting point, on page 5 of the pre-released information, or as part of the background information, candidates should have taken note of who the shareholders of OT are, their respective percentage holding, etc., and the relationship that some of the shareholders had with OT. Similarly, candidates should have taken note of who the directors of OT are, or the company's board composition, and some apparent relationships between directors, shareholders, and OT. For example, candidates should have picked up that both Bridget and Sergel, who are the CEO and CFO respectively, are both directors and shareholders of OT and that they hold a combined 51% shareholding. We will unpack as we go along how or why this information, amongst other information, was of particular importance in this task. The crux of Task C was sitting in document 4 on page 13 of the pre-released information, which was an email from the CEO, Bridget, to the financial analyst. On the email, the CEO informs the financial analyst of the fact that some of the directors of On Time have been discussing the possibility of the company declaring a dividend to shareholders to reward them for their investment and faith in the business. However, the CFO, Sergel, highlighted that even though OT is expected to make a profit in the current year, it has in the past made significant losses amounting to nearly 135 million rands. As such, declaring a dividend might not be possible. The CEO then goes on to say, as lawyers are quite expensive, for providing information that can be obtained from the internet, she is not particularly keen on obtaining legal advice on the matter, and therefore, requested the financial analyst to apply their mind as to how OT can distribute some cash to the on-time shareholders. Now, let us look at what the candidates could have picked up as triggers, started thinking about or researching, etc., during the 5-day preparation period. Looking at the extract in the previous slide, it was clear and well triggered that the candidates were requested to apply their minds on whether: Number 1. The entity can declare dividends, given the history of losses, and Number 2. If the entity can declare dividends, how they can go about this declaration. During the 5-day preparation period, candidates could have started thinking about some of the technical requirements when there is a distribution, i.e., Section 46 of the Companies Act around distributions, Section 48 dealing specifically with share buybacks, and the related tax consequences for distributions. On the next slide, we are going to unpack the requirements mentioned above. Section 46 of the Companies Act states that a distribution can only be completed if, and only if, all the following conditions have been met. 1. If the dividend is pursuant to an existing legal obligation. 2. If there is a board resolution that has been passed. 3. If the entity will satisfy the solvency and liquidity test immediately after the distribution, and 4. If the board acknowledges through a resolution that the entity satisfies the solvency and liquidity test. Section 46 goes on to state that, in instances where directors failed to vote against a distribution, despite knowing that the distribution was contrary to Section 46, the directors may be held personally liable in terms of Section 77 of the Companies Act. On the other hand, if a distribution is in a form of a share buyback, then Section 48 of the Companies Act is applicable, which requires that a special resolution be passed by the shareholders and not solely the directors. Furthermore, if the share buyback involves the acquisition of more than 5% of the issued shares, then Section 114 and 115 of the Companies Act should also be considered, which requires an independent expert's report in this regard. From a tax perspective, a dividend attracts a dividend withholding tax of 20% in South Africa. If a distribution is in a form of a share buyback, and it relates to return of the contributed tax capital, CTC, then there is no tax payable for this transaction. However, if the distribution is over and above the return of the contributed tax capital, then the distribution would attract a dividend withholding tax, accordingly. Now, let us consider the information that was presented to the candidates on the day, and whether that information supported or was in addition to what was provided as part of the pre-released information. Information presented to the candidates on the day was in Document C on page 8, where the CEO gave further information on the proposal of the dividend that was introduced in the pre-release period. The CEO starts by mentioning that when OT was established, herself and Sergel subscribed to 20 million and 31 million shares, respectively, and that they financed the acquisition of those shares through obtaining a loan from First Regional Bank. If we go back to our very first slide, we will remember that First Regional Bank is also a shareholder of OT, with a 19% shareholding there. The CEO then goes on to mention that First Regional Bank now require that both Bridget and Sergel repay 5 million rands of their respective loans within the next 3 months, and the bank is not willing to negotiate. Therefore, both the CEO and CFO are now under immense pressure to repay these loans to the bank. Simon, the First Regional Bank representative on the On-Time Board of Directors, emphasizes that the request for Bridget and Sergel to repay their respective loans is because of First Regional Bank scaling down on loans to high net worth individuals, and that it is not a reflection of a negative view of OT. Here, we can clearly see that Simon is prioritizing the interests of First Regional Bank, as his employer, over those of OT and its directors. Furthermore, Basil Oliphant, who is also a director on the OT board, indicated that the Real Equity Impact Fund of South Africa, a 30% shareholder, is also under financial pressure due to the economic conditions in South Africa, i.e., low growth, load shedding, etc., and as a result, would also be appreciative of a dividend from OT. In her closing comments on the email, Bridget then suggests that, because her and Sergel are under pressure to repay the loans to First Regional Bank, a share buyback of 30 million rands should be effected. She further states that she does not believe that a share buyback of 30 million would significantly affect OT's financial position, and that the share buyback would be a win-win for all shareholders. Candidates could have considered whether, knowing all the facts around Bridget and Sergel's loans, financial difficulties faced by the Real Equity Impact Fund of South Africa, etc., as stated above, the share buyback is really a win-win for all the stakeholders, or is only good for Bridget and Sergel so that they can repay their loans to First Regional Bank, especially because she goes on to say, Sergel and I could pocket enough to meet First Regional Bank's demands and have some left to enjoy a good holiday with our families. The last paragraph on page 8 then introduces what the task was, which the candidate was expected to respond to. Bridget requested the financial analyst or the candidate to consider the following. Number 1, the high-level legal requirements of the Companies Act that On Time would need to comply with for On Time to do the proposed share buyback. Number 2, the key issues that the Board of Directors would need to consider in deciding whether to proceed with a share buyback, and lastly, any governance issues and/or challenges facing On Time that are apparent from the information regarding the proposed cash distribution to shareholders. Taking a step back, and in summary, in the pre-released information, the candidates were informed that some directors of On Time were discussing the possibility of the company declaring a dividend to shareholders, and candidates were triggered to apply their minds as to how OT can, if at all, distribute some cash to the On Time shareholders. On the day, it was made clear that Bridget is proposing the distribution to be in a form of a share buyback, and not a dividend, as was previously mentioned in the pre-released information. Having gone through the pre-released information on the day, and the task, we will now look at some examples of high-level legal requirements for a share buyback, key issues that the board of directors would need to consider in deciding whether to proceed with a share buyback, and any governance issues and/or challenges facing on time that are apparent from the information regarding the proposed cash distribution to shareholders. We are going to split this section in the same manner as the task or the required. However, it must be noted that valid points were considered for competence of the candidates even if the candidate had covered the valid point under the incorrect heading, as long as the candidate covered all three aspects of the task in their response. From a high-level requirements perspective, candidates could have covered the following points. The fact that for a distribution to take place, a board resolution needs to be passed. Some candidates could have mentioned that a special resolution needs to be passed, which is also appropriate. However, it needs to be noted that the special resolution is from the shareholders and not from the directors. A solvency and liquidity test needs to have been assessed. Here, candidates were expected to apply the solvency test, i.e., that the assets of OT, fairly valued, exceeded the liabilities of OT, and the liquidity test, i.e., OT's ability to pay its debts as they become due in the next 12 months, to the financial information that was presented as part of the background information in the scenario, and not just dump the theory as it is from the Act. Candidates could have also mentioned that because of the apparent financial interest that both the CEO and CFO have, in that they need the distribution to repay First Regional Bank's loans, Section 75 of the Companies Act state that they need not be part of the board meeting where the decision on the distribution will be decided, and would need to recuse themselves from that meeting. Taking it a step further, candidates could have stated that in instances where directors failed to vote against a distribution, despite knowing that the distribution was contrary to Section 46, the directors may be held personally liable in terms of Section 77 of the Companies Act. In dealing with the key issues that the board of directors would need to consider in deciding whether to proceed with a share buyback or not, candidates could have covered the following points. Although the bank balance is estimated to be 150 million rands, OT has in the past made significant losses amounting to nearly 135 million rands, and therefore OT is in its recovery stage, and the share buyback might hinder the recovery. In another section of the scenario or pre-released information, it was noted that OT is considering a lease of a new aircraft and a new flight route to George. Candidates could have linked the fact that should the share buyback go ahead, it might result in OT not being able to go ahead with these planned growth initiatives, especially taking into account that demand for air travel is still not back to pre-COVID levels, and the fact that there are other key business risks, e.g., jet fuel prices, competition in the aviation industry, high fixed costs, etc., that OT needs to take into account before deciding on a share buyback. The candidates could have also questioned who will perform the valuation of the OT shares for the purposes of the share buyback, as OT is a private company, and lastly, candidates could have also discussed the tax consequences of the proposed share buyback. Moving on to the governance issues and/or challenges facing on time that are apparent from the information regarding the proposed cash distribution to shareholders, candidates could have focused on the potential ethical dilemma that is facing the CEO and the CFO regarding money that they owe First Regional Bank. This also talks to Section 76 of the Companies Act, which requires directors to act in good faith, in the best interest of the company, and not for their personal benefit. Candidates could have, thus, questioned whether Bridget's proposal is only good for her and Sergel, and not the company or other stakeholders like employees, creditors, etc., or whether by the CEO proposing a share buyback, considering the company's previous losses, growth initiatives, etc., she is acting in good faith and doing what is best for OT. Candidates could have also questioned the board composition, as ultimately there is a lack of independent non-executive directors on the board, as Bridget and Sergel both have a financial interest in the matter. Simon and Basil represent First Regional Bank and the Real Equity Impact Fund of South Africa, respectively, who also happen to be shareholders of OT. As a result, this poses issues with the decision-making on the share buyback, i.e., only 2 directors on the board can ultimately vote or decide on the proposed share buyback. Lastly, candidates could have also mentioned that another challenge could be how Simon and Basil are most likely to prioritize the interests of their employers, being First Regional Bank and the Real Equity Impact Fund of South Africa, respectively, over the interests of OT. As it can be seen from this slide, there is quite a lot that the candidates could have covered in responding to the task around High-Level Companies Act requirements, key issues, and governance concerns around share buybacks. This then concludes the feedback video for Task C. The next video will be taking us through what a competent script looked like for this task. Thank you so much for your time.